master of David. In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see. His eyelids test the children of man. The Lord tests the righteous, but his soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. Let him rain coals on the wicked, fire and sulfur, and a scorching wind shall be the portion of their cup. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteous deeds. The upright shall behold his face. And amen. We'll end a reading at the end of that psalm in verse number 7. I hope you never have to, but if you ever face a sudden attack, shock, or threat to your survival, either perceived or indeed actual, your body has this inbuilt feature that all of ours have, where it switches automatically to batten down the hatches. It goes to something a bit like safe mode on a Windows PC, if you know what that is, if you're familiar with that, where your reactions are sort of heightened, certain hormones are released, your pupils are dilated, your heart quickens, and you enter what is commonly known as fight or flight mode. The sort of experience that this might occur in might be a bomb blast or a fire in the building or a bad car accident or an attack by a terrorist or indeed an animal or something. And hopefully I'm not making you relive that tonight in church. But we're talking here about the idea that your body goes on the alert and reacts to the danger that it foresees with either fight or flight, stay and fight or run for the hills. Let's talk tonight about fear's obvious response. In Psalm number 11, King David is clearly faced with serious and mortal danger. Did you notice that? He is in a situation where his very life is threatened. David, it says in verse 1, makes it seem and sound like a very personal sort of crisis. David himself needs to take refuge, he writes. It's his soul that someone is giving advice to, there in verse 1. His enemies, described as the wicked, have been at work. They've bent the bow. In other words, they've strung their bow. They've fitted the arrow to the string. These archers are ready. They're waiting to strike. They're going to strike David by the cover of darkness, we read. Of course they are, because of course men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds are evil, as we read in John's Gospel chapter 3. These enemies are operating in the shadows, out of public sight, and of course stealth and deceit always go along with evil. You get that, don't you? You find that? Is this a literal archer that is after David's blood? Maybe. In Psalm 64, we're told that the wicked aim bitter words like arrows. So it's also possible that someone is indeed slandering David of a very strong degree. Early on, it seems personal to King David, but by verse 3, it maybe seems a little more widespread. We get the sense of maybe it being more when we read that the foundations are destroyed. Is this a pending catastrophe that's more national or societal than personal? Maybe. Are there enemies and armies indeed at the borders? Is there a threat of extinction to the nation that's real and likely? Is that what's going on? David, being king, can expect national disasters to impact him powerfully and personally, of course, because of course he's the king at the head of the nation. On August the 26th, 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. After 900 years of near impenetrable security and peace for much of it, Rome fell to a Gothic army. It was said at the time, if Rome can perish, what can be safe? In those days, Augustine, whatever you want to pronounce his name, was a 55-year-old bishop in the prime of his ministry in North Africa. as these shockwaves began to be felt across the empire. Rome had fallen. Certainties are gone. What's going to happen now? How was he going to minister when crisis and all the implications of it had changed everything overnight? Was he to call it a day? David faces a situation where the very foundations of what he and his people knew are crumbling around them. For David as the king and for the country as a whole, this is a moment of great uncertainty. We lack the details, yes, that's clear. But David faces a crisis. So what is he to do? Faced with such a desperate situation, what is he as the king of Israel to do? Well, the advice he's given is standard enough. It's one of our two natural responses to crisis. It's not fight, but flight. Faced with the desperate situation, the obvious response is put to him by his advisors. Middle of verse 1, flee like a bird to your mountain. It's run, isn't it? It's hide. Find a refuge in a safe place like a mountain or your mountain, as it's put. Perhaps go into exile in another country. You're too important to lose, David. You're the king. You need to look after yourself. Hide, in other words. Allow me to escort you, sir, to your underground bunker. We need you, Prime Minister. We need you, President, to survive this nuclear attack. You get the idea, don't you? Run. That's the natural response. And the logic, of course, is explained and justified in verse 3. I mean, if the foundations are destroyed, well, what's there left to hide? What remains? What else is there to do but run away? When you lose the foundations, of course, you lose the building. What's left? You're out of options, David. Run, flee, hide. That's the well-meaning advice that David has received in Psalm 11. But notice that it's the response of fear to do that. We know this because the response here makes no mention of God. It's entirely out of man and his natural state to say this. What can the righteous do is the way it's put at the end of verse 3. You hear the sort of, oh, we're all out of options. What else can you do in that statement? The hopelessness of it all. No other option. Perhaps you've been tempted to run away from your responsibilities. Maybe the kids have really gotten to you this time. What else can you do? Run out the door. Perhaps you want to run away from work and never come back because it's tough and you don't like it. And they don't treat you very well. Or they're shoving the pride stuff down your throat again this summer. What else can you do? Or perhaps there's a work that you're serving God in and you see nothing good coming from it, so you just want to quit, to take to your heels. What else can you do? Or imagine the sort of decisions that come to missionaries in other places where they've, cross-culturally where they are, when Ebola comes to Sierra Leone or when the quarter of Ukraine is heading over the western border in flight. The decisions that have to be made. I mean, what else can you do but run? Fear can lead us here, can't it? Nehemiah, we looked at Nehemiah and Ezra last year, is threatened by his enemies. He's tempted by someone working indeed with the enemy to go and hide in the temple, which he's not allowed to do because he's not a member of the priesthood. And what does he say? He responds with these words. Should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. Fear leads the coward to run. Real men are braver than that, and it's not just men. Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with leaving a job or relocating to a different town or leaving a ministry position for a different one, so long as there's a replacement to carry the work on that you've trained up or whatever. Nothing inherently wrong with being evacuated as a missionary. That may very well be the correct thing to do. Paul escapes Damascus down the wall in a basket, remember? Acts chapter 9, because they want to kill him. Mary and Joseph fled with Jesus to Egypt, remember? David himself fled more than once. Indeed, in particular, he fled whenever Absalom was plotting against him in 2 Samuel chapter 15. The English reformers, they fled to the continent during the reign of Queen Mary. But there is something wrong if you're leaving behind the work that God has for you. That's indeed like running away from your family, because that's the work that God has called you to do, and there's nobody thinks that's a good idea. Or works of service that he's prepared beforehand for you to do. You shouldn't run from that. For, of course, that's what he has you here for. And indeed, that's the reason why your ticker is still ticking. That's why he's got you here. To do that, well, that would be to betray the name of the Lord you are, the name of the Lord that you are and have in Christ. Committed to. To do that is responding out of fear and not out of faith. That's fear's obvious response. Secondly, let's talk about faith's prevalent question. David gets advice. They say, run and hide. But that is not what he is to do. You understand that? In Psalm number 11, we are not talking about a situation where it is right to up sticks and leave, to evacuate, to quit, to pack it all in. That's clear, isn't it? Such a counsel of despair is not the right way in this case, for fear is never the right way for God's people. Because David, of course, has responsibilities. He is the king of God's earthly kingdom of Israel. He needs to be there. He needs to trust God and be an example to lead the people to trust God as well. And he, of course, has loyalty to God above all other things. Christians are loyal. In the text, we see a big shift from verse number 3 to verse number 4. Did you notice it? Because when we get to verse number 4, David considers the Lord. The Lord is everywhere in verse 4. He's everywhere in verse 5. That's a real change in perspective for this psalm. Verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of man. In other words, God is looking on. He's in his holy temple in heaven. He has a full view of all that's going on. He sees it. This is not speaking about the temple in Jerusalem, where God's presence was between the cherubim at the Ark of the Covenant, you know. This is heaven that David's speaking about. And of course, from that vantage point, God's gaze examines everyone at all times. Because there's more, of course, to the Bible's teaching than that God sees this situation. Because in verse 1, David also states that he can take refuge in God. You see that? He can be enveloped in the arms of God. He can know the strength of God pouring into him as and when he needs it. You find people walking the most difficult of paths that God is empowering in amazing ways. I don't know if you've seen lots of that. I've seen some of that as I've been the pastor here and other places. That he enables people to function, that there's fuel for the journey when it's needed, that the injection comes when the injection is needed. You know what I mean? God is our refuge and strength, Psalm 46 says, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea. You see, even when the foundations go, there's still God. Even when the mountains go, that's the picture there. He's more constant than any mountain that you can run to. He's longer lasting, in other words. But it's not just that God sees from heaven, from his vantage point. It's not just that he can be there to take refuge in, as important as that is, comforting and supplying the needs of his people in the circumstances in which they find themselves. But biblically speaking, we also need to understand that it is also so that God is in heaven and using these circumstances as a test. Look at verse 5. The Lord tests the righteous. What do you mean? What sort of test is it? A test of what? It's a test of faith. James 1:2-4 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." God is sovereign. That means he's the king. And he's also in control. And he is God to such a complete extent that he can even use these crises as an unexpected positive, as a test, as a shaping mechanism, as a muscle builder, as a test of faith, and indeed a grower of it. Believers should see that God, from his perspective, this trouble is an opportunity to prove your faith is genuine. A test. That's a different way of thinking about it, isn't it? You agree with me on that? Maybe you say, I don't want to prove my faith. I don't want to prove my faith is genuine. Maybe you say, surely God knows that I'm his. Why does he need for me to prove my faith is genuine? Well, of course, we have to remember that he's God. And as God, he's committed to stretching you and growing you. That's what he does with Christians. That's all part of his work on you and indeed in you. So as you live your life and you face the ups and downs, in particular here the challenges, right? The crisis. Think of what you face as a test. Because that's a very different way to look at it, isn't it? And with God's perspective and grace and help, pass the test. Don't choose fear. Choose to walk by faith, because God will enable you to do that if you entrust yourself to him. This psalm is teaching us that the right question is not actually found at the end of verse 3, which is, what can the righteous do? No, the right question to ask is this one. Who is God? Who is God? Which is all over verse 4 and verse 5. Who is God? And that's always the right question to ask when trouble comes. Because that's a question of faith. Who is God? For God has not run away. He hasn't gone away, you know. He hasn't moved an inch. And he sees all with his divine eye. He assesses all. He tests the motives of all. He's not only, of course, resident in heaven. He's up there reigning in heaven. And so he has that sense of control of all of these circumstances that you're facing. They're not out of control or out of his will or out of his remit. You can take refuge in that, can't you? That God is at work in these days and these circumstances, and that it's a test of your faith. And it's in that sort of sovereignty that David can stand firm and stay put. You see that? That he can stand and take up the shield of faith and rebuff those fiery darts that come, and stand firm against the evil one who seeks to destroy his service opportunities and his gospel witness and his spiritual vitality and indeed his faith itself. Who is God? Is to ask, is the trouble greater than God or less? Is the trouble greater than God or less? Because God looks down from heaven and we're all grasshoppers. All of us, enemies, people of the earth. Is the trouble greater God than less? We live in a day of serious change, don't we? And pace of change. It's at times head spinning. And it's true that many of the things, the foundations of what we know and hold dear are crumbling around us. The foundation of basic biblical morality in our land has crumbled around us. The foundation of going to church and indeed sending your children to Sunday school has crumbled all around us. The foundation that murder is wrong has crumbled around us, if you think about it. That sexual deviancy is wrong has crumbled all around us. That what God says is good, and what God says is true, has crumbled all around us. The foundation of the nation that was built on Christian principles, cultural Christianity, you could call it, is crumbling away. And by the way, that's not all bad by any means. But it is bewildering, it is scary, and it is troubling. Now, things are worse than they were. What can the righteous do? Flee? Run away from public life? Hide in the safe place of we and us? Christians united, Christian bubble sealed with silicon at the gaps for us to just sort of hang on to each other and wait for the second coming? Is that it? What can the righteous do? But of course, that's not what the Master's told us to do. We're to be witnesses, aren't we? Acts chapter 1, verse 8. We're to be salt and light, aren't we? We're to be those who make a difference, for we're the ones who have been indwelt by the Spirit of God and live on their street. Or we work with them, or we go to school with them. We're tempted to fear. We're tempted to despair. We're tempted to ask, what can the righteous do? But of course, the right question is always the right question, which is, who is God? And that moves us on to finally faith's categorical answer. If faith's prevalent question is, who is God? Then David goes on to explain faith's categorical answer. Rather than despair in the circumstances or listen to the advice to leg it for the hills, the natural response of all of us, faith runs, but faith stands firm. Fear runs, but faith stands firm. For the answer to who is God is that the Lord, He is God. God is God, and we are not. So it's always good to remind yourself of that. You live in a world where people don't realize that. God is God, and we are not. We're looking to Him. We're not looking to our own resources, to our own skill. We're looking to Him just like Jehoshaphat, you remember in 2 Chronicles 20. We're powerless against the great horde that's coming against us, but we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on You, he says. And what's the one we look to like? Well, we get the answer in verses 4 to 7. We get the answer to what He's like. He's the sovereign one. He's the one who's in control. He's there in this holy temple. He's in the heavens, right? He's not being whisked off to the bunker for His safety. He's not pacing the floor in heaven. He's not stressed out. He's not panicked. He's not even in flight mode. Not a bit of it. No, He's on the throne, and He's calm as you like. He's not pressed by the crisis. It's all under control because He's sovereign. He's also righteous, isn't He? He's good. We see this here, don't we? The Lord is righteous, and He knows that His plan is actually all for good. Because He's good, He loves righteous deeds as well. We read that. He loves for people to do good. God delights when His people have a righteous lifestyle before Him. He loves that. But don't get this wrong. Faithfully serving God does not and will not exempt you from difficulty. Far from it. With enemies aplenty, it might bring you more. It's very possible. Very possible. God is sovereign and good and vigilant. God is all of these things. And David also here teaches in the last section that there are clearly those that God loves and those that He hates. Tim mentioned this morning. In fact, Proverbs, there are things that God really hates. We hear about it. When it comes to evildoers, God hates their ways. Proverbs 15, verse 9, He hates their thoughts. Proverbs 15, 26, He hates their worship. Proverbs 15, verse 8, and He hates their actions. Proverbs 6, verse 18. But notice here, it's the evildoers or the wicked themselves, isn't it? Read it very carefully. His soul hates the wicked and the one who loves violence. H.B. Charles was preaching on this psalm, and I got to listen to what he had to say. And at this stage, he points out that the old adage, God hates the sin and loves the sinner. David, he says, without battening an eyelid, says, no. No. The idea that God hates the sin and loves the sinner, he says, no. His soul hates the wicked. He hates the one who loves violence. In Psalm 5, verse 5, we've been in the Psalms in the summer, we've come across this already. It says, without embarrassment, that God hates evildoers. Now, we don't have any of the connotations of emotional sinfulness that you or I have whenever we hate something and we shouldn't, right? But it's still there. It's strong. It's God's propensity towards the wicked. He hates the wicked from his soul, from the very depth of his being, we're reading here. These are strong words, aren't they? They're blunt as well. But they speak clearly of God's rejection of those who oppose him. who use violence in wicked ways. And of course, their punishment here awaits them, doesn't it? His soul reacts to them with righteous revulsion as his arm extends towards them in this holy fury that we read about. Notice that David is even asking for this. This plea is here. Let him rain coals on the wicked. That's David asking God. You might call that an imprecatory prayer. There are some psalms that are like that, asking for God to judge the wicked. It's called an imprecatory psalm. Very uncomfortable, isn't it, in a world where feelings are king, where you live? Isn't it? But essential in God's just way of running the world. For this punishment is what righteousness and justice demands. Raining coals and fire and sulfur, of course, if you know your Bible, these are words associated with, in fact, the author of that Psalm 11 hymn that we sang got this as well, associated with judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, when the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire out of heaven. That great place of wickedness in the Old Testament, where Lot escaped with his 2 daughters, but his wife looked back and she's still there. That a scorching wind shall be their portion, the portion of their cup. In other words, the cup of the Lord's wrath, that their evil deeds is what they face. But not for the upright. It's not right. Not for the righteous. It's not what it says. Very last words. They shall behold the face of God. They shall, with Job, in their flesh, they shall see God. One day, faith will give way to sight, to use the words of 2 Corinthians 5 that we read and sort of twist it around, because, of course, we're still in faith, and one day it will be sight as well. But don't be mistaken, brothers and sisters. Do realize that you and I are only ever righteous because of one who's clothed us in his righteousness. You do not get to call yourself righteous according to Psalm 11 because you think you're a good person, or because you've decided that you're better than somebody else, or there's a league table of goodness and you're fairly well up there and you're nowhere near the relegation zone. No. No, it's only because of one who has taken the cup of God's wrath for you and drank every drop. Because when God looks and tests the children of man, as we read, do you know what? We all fail. We all fail the righteousness test, the uprightness test. We're all wicked in that sense. Wicked. But of course, in Jesus, when we trust in him, when we take refuge in Jesus, when we find that then that we're placed in the favor of God and in a right relationship with God, and now able to do those good deeds which actually please him. You see? Verse 7. Not perfectly, not in some way still tinged by the old man, the old woman, but still good deeds that God loves for us to do. Whatever the crisis you face, do you know that the one who trusts in the Lord is safe and secure? Did you know that? Because you can hide in the Lord and in his sovereignty. It doesn't mean he's going to protect you from everything you wouldn't write for yourself or choose, but it does mean that you can trust him with the events of your life and say, you know what, I don't know what you're doing here, but you know what, I trust you. And you can hide in that sort of sovereignty. And with that sort of sovereign God that we have, we can take refuge, we can take strength from that. We can ask him whatever he wants, and if he wants you to stay in this situation, you of course stay in that situation. Should I stay or should I go? That's the clash, I think, isn't it? And you serve him there as a man or woman of faith and commitment and loyalty. Because fear runs, and faith stands firm. Now, the circumstances may be challenging, they may be undesirable, but it's very possible, indeed likely, that he has you in that job, in that position in church, in these circumstances, on that street, for such a time as this, just like Esther, remember? Because she learned, and indeed she had to face the crisis of her day when the people, including herself, were about to be annihilated. The whole nation. where the Sloans, the Brethren missionaries in Lviv in western Ukraine, stayed last spring. And the people, of course, then realized that their fear of Russian rockets was less than their desire to please God. And that said something. Or where UFM missionaries like Jean Doumbia returned to Sierra Leone despite the threat of Ebola, and that said something. Or where someone considered leaving a job or a place of service or whatever the situation, asked for wisdom and stuck at it, because God has more yet for them to do there. When the heat's on, when the crisis comes, there's two responses, aren't there? A natural, fearful response to throw in the towel, to sort of leg it, to hide. Even Elijah, of course, he wanted to die. That's how far he was wanting to run. Or a response of faith that says, God is God. He's in control. He's good. He's at work. He enables his people to stand firm. We can take refuge in that sort of sovereignty. And one day, of course, the pure in heart will see God. And as we read in Revelation 22, the hope of every contrite, believing heart is that they will see his face. Face to face shall I behold him, far beyond the starry sky, says the old hymn. As a Christian, your safe mode is to remember who God is and what he's like. And that's good to remember, isn't it? In all the troubles of life that come your way. Let's pray together.